The Ottavio Bottecchia case. He won the Tour de France twice. He was an Italian war hero. And on the morning of June 3, 1927, he was found alone on a roadside in Friuli, his skull cracked, his collarbone shattered. His bicycle was leaning neatly against a nearby fence, not a scratch on it. There were no skid marks, no sign of a car, no sign of a fall, nothing to explain how a man with 2 broken bones got there. Nobody saw what happened. And the road was completely empty when they found him. He died 11 days later without ever regaining consciousness. The investigation lasted less than a week. A fascist commander ordered the local sergeant to log the cause of death as sunstroke and close the case. So they did. Just like that. But here's where it gets stranger. 12 days before Ottavio was found on that road, his brother Giovanni had been killed by a car on the exact same stretch of road. 2 brothers, same road, 2 weeks apart. Bottecchia was not just a cyclist, he was a vocal socialist. He trained with a friend who openly read anti-Mussolini pamphlets. He was the kind of man that made powerful people uncomfortable in 1920s fascist Italy. Over the years, 2 deathbed confessions surfaced. A man dying on a New York pier in the 1940s claimed he had been hired as a hitman. A farmer from the region claimed he had thrown a single rock at a grape thief who had wandered into his vineyard. But grapes don't ripen in early June. One rock doesn't break a skull and a collarbone while leaving a bicycle pristine. And then a priest who had administered last rites to Bottecchia made his own deathbed statement. He said the fascists had killed him. Nobody was ever arrested. No inquest was ever reopened. Historian John Foote spent years piecing together what happened and concluded the evidence was strong but untested. The Italian government never looked again. Ottavio Bottecchia's killer has never been identified. His case has never been solved. And it gets stranger from there. The Schendinghi assassination. It was a Tuesday morning on August 28, 1928, and Schendinghi was on a bus. He was 45 years old, a politician, a revolutionary, and a man who had made enemies on every side of China's brutal civil conflicts. He had helped found the Shanghai Communist Group in 1920. He led the country's first Marxist-influenced peasant rent strike in 1921. And then he switched sides, defected from the Communists, and personally directed a 1927 KMT purge that killed hundreds of his former comrades in Zhejiang province. He had betrayed landlords. He had betrayed communists. He had started defying the KMT government as well. So on that Tuesday morning, 2 men in white shirts boarded the same bus as Schendinghi in Hangzhou. They rode with him calmly. When Shen stood to hand over his ticket at the front of the bus, both men drew pistols and shot him in the chest and head. Then they stood over his body and fired 10 more rounds. They walked off the bus. They fired at anyone who tried to follow them. And they vanished. The case was investigated. The investigation went nowhere. Because the problem wasn't a lack of suspects. The problem was that there were too many. The landlords he had ruined wanted him dead. The communists he had betrayed wanted him dead. The KMT government he had recently begun to oppose wanted him silenced. Historian R. Keith Schappa spent years studying the case and concluded the KMT was the most probable culprit, with some evidence suggesting Chiang Kai-shek personally ordered the killing through a general. But it remained circumstantial. What investigators could never explain was how the men on that bus knew Shen's exact routine. They boarded in Hangzhou. They knew which bus. They knew which stop. They knew exactly when he would stand up. Somebody on the inside told them. Nobody ever admitted who. Decades later, during the Cultural Revolution, Schendinghi's tomb was dynamited. Even his grave became an unsolved disturbance. Nobody was ever charged with his murder. The Filippo Halsman trial. September 10, 1928. A father and his 22-year-old son are hiking in the Zillertal Alps in Austria. Filippo Halsman said he was walking ahead on the trail when he heard his father cry out. He turned around. His father, Max, was falling into a brook. By the time Philippe reached help and returned, Max Halsman had been beaten to death with a sharp stone. The stone was still there, bearing Max's blood and hair. Max's wallet was empty. The money was gone. Philippe was the only one there. Austrian police arrested him almost immediately. But 2 weeks after the murder, investigators found something at the crime scene. Blood-stained banknotes were discovered hidden under a rock pile that had not been there before. Banknotes, hidden, near the trail. That is direct evidence of a robber-killer who had been to the scene afterward. The prosecution ignored it. Instead, they invoked Sigmund Freud's Oedipus complex and argued that Philippe must have secretly wanted to kill his own father. The Zillertal region had been experiencing a string of unsolved bandit attacks at the time. Police never pursued the obvious suspect pool of local criminals. Philippe was convicted. 9 votes to 3. The backlash was immediate. Sigmund Freud himself wrote a public rebuttal pointing out that a universal psychological complex proves nothing about a specific individual's guilt. Albert Einstein signed protest letters. Thomas Mann signed protest letters. Paul Painlevé, the French mathematician and former prime minister, signed protest letters. The sentence was eventually reduced. Philippe Halsmann was pardoned in 1930 on one condition. He had to leave Austria forever and never return. He went on to become one of the most famous portrait photographers of the 20th century. He photographed Einstein. He photographed Dalí. He photographed Marilyn Monroe. The real killer of Max Halsmann was never sought, never found, and never charged. The hidden banknotes were never explained. The Honor Bright murder. Just before dawn on June 9, 1925, a timber carter found a young woman dead at the Ticknock Crossroads in the Dublin Mountains. Her name was Elizabeth O'Neill. She went by Honor Bright. She was 25 years old and had named her 4-year-old son, Kevin Barry, after the executed IRA volunteer. She had been shot through the heart with a single revolver bullet. The night before her death, witnesses had seen her arguing with 2 well-dressed drunk men outside the Shelbourne Hotel in Dublin City. They had watched her get bundled into a gray Swift 2-seater car at Leonard's Corner. The car belonged to Dr. Patrick Purcell, a Wicklow doctor. His companion that evening was Leopold Dillon, a serving superintendent in the Garda Síochána, the brand-new Irish police force. Both men were tried for murder at Green Street Courthouse in February 1926, the highest-profile criminal case in the young Irish Free State. The jury took 3 minutes to acquit them. 3 minutes. Ballistics had reportedly failed to definitively match Purcell's revolver to the bullet. The defense had shredded 2 key witnesses. And the Garda, a force barely 3 years old, closed ranks around one of its own senior officers. Garda files related to this case remain restricted nearly a century later. In the decades since, journalists and researchers have put forward other theories. A taxi driver named Ernest Woodruff has been floated as an alternative suspect. One researcher even proposed a connection to W.B. Yeats, then a Free State senator who curiously vanished from all public appearances in the days between his speech on the divorce bill and the premiere of The Plow and the Stars. Both events bracketed the acquittal. Nobody has ever been held responsible for the death of Honor Bright. Her son grew up not knowing what had happened to his mother. The Vera Hode murder. February 25, 1924. An 11-year-old girl named Vera Hode walked home from her music lesson in Chichester, Sussex, and disappeared into a snowstorm. 61 hours later, a deaf-mute patient at Graylingwell Mental Hospital tried to communicate something to his bailiff. He signed that he had seen something unusual in a nearby field. They went to look. They needed a blowtorch to free Vera's body from the ice. She had been strangled manually. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been left in the snow long enough that she had frozen solid into the field. The investigation was enormous. Police took over 1,200 witness statements. They paraded 150 soldiers from the local army barracks past investigators. The level of violence suggested the attacker had injured himself, so officers interviewed every person they could find. Scotland Yard offered a £200 reward, which was a significant sum in 1924. The only physical clue was a fragment of a patched man's shirt found near the body. After news of this broke, housewives across Chichester quietly stopped hanging patched shirts out on their clotheslines to dry. Nobody wanted to be connected. A local insurance agent became the unofficial prime suspect. He had been seen talking to several young girls in the area. He reportedly fell into heavy drinking after Vera's murder. But police could never build a case. Vera's father killed himself 9 years later. In 1994, a journalist wrote a 75th anniversary piece about the case. A childhood friend of Vera's, elderly but still alive, finally broke her silence and spoke about what she remembered. Shortly after the piece was published, the journalist received a phone call. An anonymous old man on the line told him to keep his nose out of it. 70 years later, someone still didn't want it discussed. The murder of Vera Hode was never solved. The Glozell Mystery, March 1st, 1924. A cow's hoof breaks through the ground on a farm in Glozell, a tiny hamlet near Vichy, France. 17-year-old Émile Fradin and his grandfather climb down into what turns out to be an underground chamber. What they pull out will split the scientific world in two for the next century. Over 3,000 artifacts, ceramic tablets, stone figurines, glass-covered bricks, human bones, and inscriptions. A strange script that blended Neolithic-era symbols with what appeared to be Phoenician characters. If genuine, these tablets would push the origins of written language back by thousands of years. If fake, it was one of the most elaborate forgeries in the history of archaeology. Within 3 years, 2 separate international scientific commissions had examined the site and reached opposite conclusions. One declared it a fraud. The other declared it authentic. The French police raided Émile Fradin's museum. Criminal forgery charges were filed against him in 1929. He won his appeal in 1931. He also won a defamation suit against a curator from the Louvre who had called him a forger. Modern thermoluminescence dating conducted since the 1970s made things even more confusing. Some objects test as medieval in age, some test as Iron Age, some test as modern forgeries. And the script on the tablets appears nowhere else on Earth. There is no known language it connects to. Nobody has been able to read it. A French Ministry of Culture report was commissioned in 1995. It was never fully published. Émile Fradin lived to the age of 103. He never recanted. He never admitted to any forgery. He maintained until his death that he had simply found what was already there, buried in the ground of his family's farm. Roughly 2,630 catalogued objects from Glozell still sit in a museum in the village, awaiting modern reanalysis that may never come. Nobody knows what the tablets say. Nobody knows who made them or when.